Beyond family trauma, the country as psychological architect. Most people have heard of family of origin trauma. You grow up in a home with a certain emotional climate. Maybe it was chaotic. Maybe it was rigid. Maybe love was conditional. Maybe conflict was silent. Maybe achievement was currency. Maybe vulnerability was weakness. Whatever the atmosphere, you adapted. And those adaptations became your personality. You learned when to speak and when to stay quiet. You learned whether authority was safe or dangerous. You learned whether love required performance. You learned how much of yourself to show. Then, as adults, we spend years untangling what was just who we are from what was survival. Family of origin trauma gives language to that process. It helps us understand that many of our habits were intelligent responses to early environments. But here's a question most people never ask. What if your family was only half the story? What if the other half was the country? You were not raised in a vacuum. Before your parents ever spoke to you, they were shaped. Before they decided how strict to be, how expressive to be, how ambitious to be, how fearful to be, they were shaped by something larger. They were shaped by history. They were shaped by economic systems. They were shaped by war, scarcity, ideology, media narratives, and collective memory. And those forces shaped the emotional climate of your home. The country is not just geography. It is a psychological ecosystem. It teaches you what success looks like, what failure costs, whether authority is to be trusted or feared, whether standing out is rewarded or punished, whether emotions are expressed or swallowed, whether safety is abundant or fragile. You do not consciously choose these lessons. You absorb them. And if you never leave your country, they feel like reality. If you do leave, the shock is disorienting. You begin to notice that what felt universal was local. What felt rational was cultural. What felt personal was inherited. This book introduces a framework for understanding that inheritance. I call it national imprint. National imprint. The country as psychological architect. A national imprint is the set of psychological defaults shaped by the country in which you were formed. Not just citizenship, formation. It is the combination of historical memory, political structure, economic model, cultural norms, education system, media ecosystem, collective traumas and triumphs. These forces quietly wire how people think, feel, compete, trust, and belong. Some imprints are forged in catastrophe. Some are forged in long-term oppression. Some are forged in chronic instability. And some are forged in subtle, everyday conditioning that never looks like trauma at all. That distinction matters. Because not everything is trauma, but everything leaves an imprint. To make sense of this, we need structure. The spectrum of national imprint. Imagine a continuum. On one end, acute, catastrophic events that rupture a nation's psyche. On the other end, subtle, socially accepted norms that shape behavior without ever being questioned. Between those poles lie layers of systemic and chronic pressures. Here is the taxonomy. Catastrophic trauma, systemic oppression, chronic instability, subtle cultural conditioning. These are not rigid boxes. They overlap. A country can embody all four in different regions or populations. But thinking in categories prevents two common mistakes. Over-dramatizing subtle cultural differences as trauma. Underestimating the psychological weight of large-scale history. Let's examine each. Category 1. Catastrophic trauma. Catastrophic trauma refers to acute, large-scale events that shock a nation's nervous system. War, genocide, partition, mass displacement, revolution, terrorist attacks. Natural disasters of historic scale. Think of Japan after World War II. The atomic bombings were not just military events. They were psychic ruptures. A collective confrontation with vulnerability, loss, and reconstruction. Or India's partition in 1947. Millions displaced. Communities fractured. Violence embedded into memory. The trauma did not end when borders were drawn. It entered family stories, silence, and inherited caution. Or Rwanda after the 1994 genocide. Or Germany after the Holocaust. These events produce something close to collective PTSD. Not every individual experiences trauma directly. But the national narrative changes. Children grow up in households shaped by loss, fear, survivor guilt, determination to rebuild, a vow of never again. Catastrophic trauma can produce extraordinary resilience. It can also produce hypervigilance, shame, and silence. It can create cultures of endurance. It can also create cultures of suppression. The imprint of catastrophe lingers long after the event itself. Category 2. Systemic oppression. Not all trauma explodes. Some of it lingers. Systemic oppression refers to long-standing structures that disadvantage certain groups, racially, politically, economically, or socially. Apartheid in South Africa. Caste hierarchies in India. Racial segregation in the United States. Colonial exploitation across Africa and Asia. These systems do not always produce one dramatic rupture. Instead, they embed chronic stress into daily life. They shape internalized shame, hyper-awareness of status, distrust of institutions, identity fragmentation. Oppression can be explicit or subtle, but over time it shapes how entire populations see themselves. A child growing up in a society where their group is marginalized absorbs messages long before they understand policy. Who is safe? Who is valued? Who belongs? Who must overperform to be accepted? Even after formal reforms, the psychological imprint remains. And those imprints travel across generations. Category 3. Chronic instability. Some countries are not defined by one catastrophic rupture or a single oppressive system. Instead, they are shaped by ongoing volatility, economic swings, political corruption, high crime rates, institutional inconsistency, unpredictable social safety nets. Chronic instability creates a background hum of uncertainty. Brazil's economic volatility, persistent gun violence in parts of the United States, political turbulence in parts of Latin America or Africa. When instability becomes normal, people adapt. They become resourceful, quick to pivot, emotionally guarded, financially defensive, distrustful of long-term promises. Hypervigilance becomes practical. Optimism becomes cautious. The nervous system learns to expect disruption. This is not necessarily trauma in the clinical sense, but it is conditioning under stress. Category 4. Subtle cultural conditioning. Here is where it becomes uncomfortable, because not all imprints look dramatic. Some are so normalized they are invisible. Subtle cultural conditioning refers to socially accepted norms that shape thinking and behavior without ever being labeled as harmful. Consider Singapore's concept of kiasu, fear of losing out. It fuels ambition, competitiveness, and excellence. It also produces anxiety and relentless comparison. Consider the United Kingdom's emotional reserve, the stiff upper lip. It creates composure and social stability. It can also create emotional distance. Consider Japan's gammon, enduring hardship quietly. It fosters discipline and social harmony. It can also suppress vulnerability. Consider the United States' intense individualism. It produces innovation and reinvention. It can also produce isolation and hyper-competition. These patterns do not arise from catastrophe. They emerge from economic models, historical pathways, and cultural myths. They are not inherently pathological, but they are powerful. And because they are normalized, they are rarely examined. Why this taxonomy matters. Without structure, conversations about national psychology become political arguments. With structure, they become self-reflection. This taxonomy protects against two extremes. Extreme 1. Everything is trauma. Not every cultural difference is a wound. Some are strengths. Some are adaptive strategies. Extreme 2. Nothing affects me. The belief that you are entirely self-made is comforting. It is also rarely true. The spectrum allows nuance. You may not carry catastrophic trauma, but you may carry scarcity conditioning. You may not have experienced systemic oppression, but you may have internalized competitive anxiety. You may not come from chronic instability, but you may have absorbed emotional restraint as normal. Imprint is not destiny, but imprint is real. The illusion of personality. Here is the uncomfortable thought. Many of the traits you defend as just who I am may be adaptive responses to your national context. Are you risk-averse? Or did you grow up in a society where failure had high social cost? Are you emotionally reserved? Or did you grow up where vulnerability was socially discouraged? Are you obsessed with stability? Or did your country's history teach that safety is fragile? Are you fiercely independent? Or did your environment reward self-reliance over interdependence? This is not about blame. It is about awareness. Because awareness allows choice. A brief self-assessment. Identifying your national imprint, answer the following questions honestly. There are no right answers. 1. How do you define success? A. Personal freedom and self-expression. B. Stability and security. C. Social harmony and belonging. D. Status and recognition. And E. Avoiding loss or falling behind. Which of these feels instinctive rather than chosen? 2. How do you respond to authority? A. I question it automatically. B. I respect it unless proven wrong. C. I avoid confrontation. D. I distrust institutions. E. I feel safer when rules are clear. 3. What triggers anxiety for you most? A. Being average. B. Financial instability. C. Social rejection. D. Public failure. E. Unpredictable change. 4. How comfortable are you with emotional expression? A. Very comfortable. I value openness. B. Selectively expressive. C. I prefer composure. D. I process privately. E. Emotional intensity feels risky. 5. When making major decisions, what weighs most heavily? A. Personal fulfillment. B. Family expectations. C. Long-term security. D. Social perception. E. Minimizing risk. Notice patterns. You are not diagnosing trauma. You are identifying conditioning. The goal of this book, this chapter does not argue that your country harmed you. It argues that your country shaped you. Sometimes that shaping was protective. Sometimes it was limiting. Sometimes it was both. The goal is not to discard your origins, it is to examine them. Because once you see the architecture, you can decide which rooms to keep and which walls to remove. Awareness is power. When you understand family of origin trauma, you stop blaming yourself for patterns that were adapted. When you understand national imprint, you stop mistaking conditioning for personality. You begin to ask, is this fear mine? Is this ambition mine? Is this silence mine? Is this distrust mine? Or did I inherit it? And if I inherited it, do I want to keep it? You inherited a family. You inherited a country. But inheritance is not obligation. The first step towards psychological sovereignty is recognizing the architect. In the next chapter, we will examine how nations wire nervous systems, not metaphorically, but neurologically, through collective fear, scarcity, authority structures, education systems, and digital narratives. Because once you understand the mechanism, the imprint becomes visible. And what becomes visible can be rewritten.